Today, we'll be learning about the anatomy of the vertebral column. So the vertebral column and the spinal cord are two structures that might be mistaken for one another, and it's important to know the difference. The vertebral column, otherwise known as the spinal column, consists of the vertebrae and the intervertebral discs that comprise it, whereas the spinal cord, which is a completely separate structure, is actually a part of the central nervous system. In the image on the right, we can see a cross-section of the vertebral column, and the yellow structure that passes through the vertebral column, that is the spinal cord. The spinal cord passes through a protective hollow space in the vertebral column known as the vertebral canal. The vertebral column is made up of 33 vertebrae. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae. Note that there are 12 thoracic vertebrae for each pair of ribs that we have in our rib cage. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 sacral vertebrae, and these sacral vertebrae fuse to become the sacrum. And there are 3 to 5 coccygeal vertebrae which fuse to become the coccyx, otherwise known as the tailbone. A fun way to remember the number of vertebrae is by matching them with meal times. We eat breakfast around 7, so there are 7 cervical vertebrae. Lunch at 12 reminds us of the 12 thoracic vertebrae, and dinner at 5 helps us remember that there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. Movement is only permitted in the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. The sacral and coccygeal vertebrae are fused, so they don't permit for any movement. The movements that are exhibited by the vertebral column include forward flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation that we can see in the pictures below. Let's take a look at some of the bony landmarks of your typical vertebra. So this image here shows the superior view of your typical vertebra. At the bottom here, we have the body. The body is a necessary portion of the vertebra that bears the weight of the body. Moving on, we have the superior articular process or facet. We have the transverse process. If we have a superior articular process, you can assume that we also have an inferior articular process or facet. On the posterior aspect of the vertebra, we have the spinous process. These are the bumps that can be felt on your back. The transverse and spinous processes also serve as attachment points for muscles and ligaments. Moving on, we have the lamina. The lamina directly translates to flat plate. This is something that's a little more evident when we take a look at the vertebra from a different view. Moving on, we have the pedicle. The pedicle means little foot or small stalk. Together, the laminae and the pedicles join to form the vertebral arch. And finally, we have the vertebral foramen. Foramen meaning hole, and this is formed by the vertebral arch and the posterior aspect of the vertebral body. The vertebral foramen is very important as it allows for protected passage of the spinal cord. Let's take a look at your typical vertebra from a different perspective now. This is from a lateral view. Starting from the bottom, we have the inferior articular process or facet. Then we have the spinous process. Then we have the transverse process. Then we have the superior articular process or facet. It becomes more evident that one is definitely superior and one is definitely inferior from a lateral view. Something that we weren't able to see from the superior view that we are able to see from the lateral view is the superior vertebral notch. Moving on, there's the pedicle from a lateral view. There's the body. And again, if we have a superior vertebral notch, you can also assume that we have an inferior vertebral notch. Now here's a lateral view of an articulated pair of vertebrae. There is the superior articular process. There is the inferior articular process. Not to be confused, because the superior articular process actually belongs to the inferior vertebra in this case, and the inferior articular process belongs to the superior vertebra in this image. These two facets join to form the zygapophyseal joint or the facet joint. When the vertebrae are articulated, we see a structure called the intervertebral foramen become formed. This foramen allows for the passage of the spinal nerves. And we also have the intervertebral disc. This disc forms a cartilaginous joint between adjacent vertebral bodies. So the vertebrae of different regions of the vertebral column have different characteristics. We'll take a look at some of the different characteristics of the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. Starting off with cervical, the cervical vertebrae are small with rectangular bodies, and their transverse processes contain a hole called the transverse foramen. The transverse foramen allows for the passage of the vertebral arteries, which travel to the brain. The spinous processes are bifid, which means that they split into two tips, which you can see in the image on the right in the red circle. And the facets of the cervical vertebrae face superiorly and inferiorly, as you can see indicated with the red arrows in the image on the right. Because they face superior and inferiorly, this allows for motion in all directions. 2 of our 7 cervical vertebrae differ quite a bit from the other vertebrae, and those are the C1 and C2 bones. Let's take a look at some of the bony landmarks on the C1 bone first. The C1 bone is also known as the atlas bone, and in this image we see a superior view of the bone. Starting off at the bottom, we see our vertebral foramen. That is just the large hole that is in the middle of the bone. From the superior view, we're also able to see the transverse foramen better, which is something that's unique to the cervical vertebrae. We have the anterior arch and the posterior arch. Moving on, here is a superior view of the C2 vertebra, otherwise known as the axis. Starting at the bottom, we have the vertebral foramen. Then we have the body. Just superior to the body is the dens. The dens is a bony projection that fits into C1 and acts as a pivot. Finally, we have the spinous process. Notice how the spinous process of the C2 bone is bifid, which was a characteristic that was unique to the cervical vertebrae. Now let's take a look at some of the regional characteristics of the thoracic vertebrae. As we move down the vertebral column, the vertebrae typically become larger and larger. The thoracic vertebrae are medium-sized to be exact. The bodies are heart-shaped, and they also have costal facets for the ribs. We can see this circled in red in the image on the right, which shows a posterolateral view of the thoracic vertebrae. The transverse processes also have articular facets for the ribs. The spinous processes of the thoracic vertebrae are long and slender, and they look like a giraffe's head. Finally, the articular facets face anteriorly and posteriorly, as indicated by the red arrows in the image on the right, and this allows for rotation and lateral flexion in the thoracic region. Finally, we'll take a look at some of the regional characteristics of the lumbar vertebrae. The body of the lumbar vertebrae are large-sized, and they are kidney-shaped. The transverse processes are long and slender, as you can see in the image on the right, which shows a posterior view of the lumbar vertebrae. And the spinous processes are short, hatchet-shaped, and from a posterior view, they look like a moose's head. The articular facets face medially and laterally, as indicated with the red arrows in the image on the right. This allows for flexion and extension of the vertebrae in the lumbar region. The orientation of the articular facets influences the movements that are permitted within each region of the vertebral column. An easy way you can remember which way the articular facets of each region of the vertebral column face is with the saying, "Can you raise the roof? Try stopping. Let's clap." So the first letter of each sentence describes the region of the spine which each sentence applies to. For the first sentence, "Can you raise the roof?" it starts with a C, so this sentence applies to the cervical region. For the second sentence, the sentence starts with a T, so this sentence applies to the thoracic region. And the third sentence, "Let's clap," represents the lumbar region of the vertebral column. You can apply this statement to remember the direction of articular facets by performing the action that is described in each sentence. So in the first sentence, "Can you raise the roof?" in the bottom left image, we can see that the palms are facing the ceiling. We can deduce that the articular facets of the cervical vertebrae face superiorly and inferiorly based off the direction of the palms. For the thoracic region of the vertebral column, we can perform the universal hand gesture for stopping. In this case, the palms face forwards, so we know that the articular facets of the thoracic region of the vertebral column face anteriorly and posteriorly. And finally, for the lumbar region of the vertebral column, we can place our hands together in front of us as if we were clapping, and from this we can deduce that the directions of the articular facets for the lumbar vertebrae face medially and laterally. In order to connect the direction of the articular facets to the related movement, we can slide the surface of our palms relative to one another without bringing our hands apart. For example, in the clapping position, I can slide my palms forward and backwards relative to one another, and from this I can deduce that in the lumbar region of the vertebral column, flexion and extension of the vertebral column are permitted. Let's take a look at the types of joints related to the vertebral column. The first type of joint we're going to look at are the joints between the vertebral bodies. So between the vertebral bodies, there are secondary cartilaginous joints called symphyses. They're joined by an intervertebral disc, which have an outer ring called the annulus fibrosus, and a gel-like center called the nucleus pulposus. These discs allow movement and absorb shock when we move and jump. Next, let's talk about the joints of the vertebral arches. These joints are also known as the zygapophyseal joints or the facet joints. These joints are plain synovial joints, which allow for gliding and sliding movements. To test yourself, looking at the image on the right, which type of vertebrae is this most likely? Take some time to think about this before I reveal the answer. The image on the right most likely depicts two articulated lumbar vertebrae. We can think about the regional characteristics that we talked about previously. One of the characteristics of the lumbar vertebrae was the short and hatchet-shaped spinous processes. We can see the resemblance between the head of the hatchet and the spinous processes in the image on the right. Another indicator that tells us that this is a pair of lumbar vertebrae is the direction that the articular facets face. We can see that the articular facets face medially and laterally in this image. Some indicators that we are not looking at cervical or thoracic vertebrae are that there are no transverse foramen, which was a characteristic of the cervical vertebrae, and there are no costal facets, which was a regional characteristic of the thoracic vertebrae. The atlantoaxial joint is formed by the articulation between the atlas and the dens of the axis. In the image on the right, we can see a superior view of the C1 bone articulated with the C2 bone. In this image, we see a structure that we didn't see in one of the images we saw previously, which is the transverse ligament. The main function of the transverse ligament is to keep the atlas, or the C1 bone, from moving forward over the axis, or the C2 bone, and to keep the dens of the axis in place against the atlas. Furthermore, we see the superior articular process. The superior articular process of the C1 bone articulates with a part of the skull, which we will look at later on in this video. Here we have the dens of the C2 bone, and we also have the anterior arch of C1. The atlantoaxial joint is classified as a pivot synovial joint. This joint permits rotational movement of the head, most notably associated with the action of shaking the head to express no. The atlanto-occipital joint is formed between the superior articular facets of the atlas and the occipital condyles of the occipital bone of the skull. In the top image on the right, which shows the inferior view of the base of the skull, we see the occipital bone highlighted in green. One of the bony landmarks on the occipital bone is the occipital condyle, which is the bony landmark which articulates with the superior articular process of the C1 vertebra. In the image on the bottom, we see a posterior view of the occipital bone, the C1 vertebra, and the C2 vertebra. And from this angle, we can also see better how the occipital condyle and the superior articular process of the C1 vertebra articulate to form the atlanto-occipital joint. This joint is classified as a condyloid synovial joint, and it permits flexion and extension at the head, most commonly associated with the action of nodding to express yes. Let's take a look at the ligaments of the vertebral column. There are 7 ligaments that we're going to be taking a look at. Please keep in mind that the anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments are abbreviated as ALL and PLL in the following slide. The ligaments of the vertebral column primarily function to stabilize the vertebral column, hold the vertebrae in their proper positions, and to limit excessive movement. First, we have the posterior longitudinal ligament. This ligament runs along the posterior surface of the bodies of the vertebral column within the vertebral canal. Next, we have ligamentum flavum. This ligament runs between the laminae of the vertebrae. Next, we have the nuchal ligament. The nuchal ligament is a ligament that is only located in the cervical region of the vertebral column. It is an extension of another ligament, and it also provides an attachment point for the trapezius muscle, specifically the upper fibers of the muscle. Moving on, we have the interspinous ligament. There seems to be a bit of overlap between the nuchal ligament and the interspinous ligament in the image on the left, which shows a lateral view. However, you can see that each ligament is unique based off the direction of the fibers of each ligament. The interspinous ligament runs between the spinous processes of the vertebral column. The final ligament that we see in the image on the left is the supraspinous ligament. The supraspinous ligament connects the tips of each spinous process of the vertebral column, and it starts at C7 and continues inferiorly. The nuchal ligament is an extension of the supraspinous ligament. In the image on the right, which shows an anterolateral view of the vertebral column, we see the intertransverse ligament. The intertransverse ligament travels between the transverse processes of the vertebral column. Finally, we see the anterior longitudinal ligament. Much like the posterior longitudinal ligament, this ligament runs along the surface of the bodies. However, this one runs on the anterior aspect of the vertebral column. The vertebral column exhibits primary kyphotic curvatures, which are concave anteriorly, and secondary lordotic curvatures, which are convex anteriorly. Primary curvatures, including the thoracic and sacral regions of the vertebral column, develop during fetal life. Secondary curvatures, including the cervical and lumbar regions, develop later, such as when infants begin lifting their heads and walking. Pathological curvatures occur when normal vertebral alignment is exaggerated or altered. Kyphosis involves an excessive thoracic curvature and frequently occurs with aging and osteoporosis. Kyphosis is also known as hunchback. Lordosis involves exaggerated curvature of the lumbar region and is commonly observed in pregnancy and obesity. Lordosis is also known as swayback. Finally, scoliosis is characterized by lateral deviation of the vertebral column. We can see all 3 pathological curvatures in the image on the right. The Erector Spinae muscle group is the main muscle group that is responsible for maintaining the posture and controlling the movements of the vertebral column. This group of muscle includes the iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinalis muscles. Their names reflect their anatomical attachments. For iliocostalis, ilio means that the muscle is related to the ilium, which is one of the hip bones. Costo meaning that the muscle is related to the ribs. For spinalis, spino means that the muscle is related to the spinous processes of the vertebral column. We can see these three muscles in the image on the right, which shows a posterior view of the erector spinae muscle group. An easy way to remember the three erector spinae muscles is with the saying, I like standing. The first letter of each word in this sentence represents one of the muscles in the erector spinae muscle group, I representing iliocostalis, L representing longissimus, and S representing spinalis.